Welcome to Books at Berklee. I'm your host, Judy Pinnolis, Associate Director of Instruction and Engagement at the Berklee College Library. Today, we welcome Ellen Cassedy. Ellen Cassedy is the author of a new book, Working 9 to 5, A Woman's Movement, a Labor Union, and the Iconic Movie, with a foreword by Jane Fonda. The book is a first-person account of her experience as a founder of the 925 organization of women office workers that began here in Boston 50 years ago, her years as a leader of the working women's movement, and a look at what that movement achieved and what's left to be done. Ellen is a former columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News. She was a speechwriter in the Clinton administration and is the award-winning author of several previous books. She lives in New York City. Welcome, Ellen.
Thanks so much, Judy.
I'm excited to do this book today. First of all, just so exciting about the 925 organization. And you have written really a cross between kind of a history of labor movement in the United States and a memoir. Tell our audience about your approach to writing this book with this kind of cross purposes.
Yeah, that's very insightful. I believe that the books I love to read offer an intimate perch from which to observe and learn about and explore a wider world. So what I tried to do in this book was blend my own personal experience with a broader social history. So here I was, a founder of the 9 to 5 organization in 1973 in Boston. And I was, 23 years old. It was 50 years ago. And I was just starting out as an organizer and as somebody who thought of myself as a social change agent. I was also starting out as a girlfriend, and I tried to blend those strands in the book and really give the reader a place to be by my side as I moved into this much bigger world. Because if you read a history that says, 200,000 people demonstrated in Washington today, or here are the achievements of this movement, you don't really get that up close feeling about what it felt like to be there. And I wanted to write the kind of book that I was hungry for back then, a book that conveyed what it was like to be working 12 hours a day in a tiny beehive of an office, full of dreams and passion and energy. And what it was like to see women joining together and growing together and winning together. But I also wanted to convey the hard parts, my doubts, how sometimes I just wanted to throw in the towel. And as I say, I wanted to talk about what it meant to be becoming a member of a social change movement at the same time that I was trying to figure out, how do I get my needs met by my boyfriend? How do I make my voice heard? So it was very personal for me.
Yeah, I couldn't put the book down, honestly. You really achieved that sense of, really being there for the reader. I really appreciated that. What did you hope to accomplish more in terms of the history of the book and telling people about what that was like?
We really did make history back then in the early 70s. When we started out, one working woman in 3 was an office worker, but we were off the radar. When people thought worker, they thought a man with a hard hat wielding a wrench. And when we went around and talked to union leaders, they just it was not part of their picture that there were women who were out there and unorganized, wanting their rights, wanting respect. And that could be quite a fruitful place for unions to go. So I wanted to talk about that history and how a sleeping giant began to stir, and how we had to find our own way and follow our noses and figure out ways to make the voices of this unheard part of the workforce heard.
No, that's really great. For those not familiar with this basic storyline of the creation of this organization, could you just briefly tell our audience a little bit, kind of a broad view of how that came about and how you chose women office workers? You mentioned that they were like about a third of the working women population, but how did you choose that as your focus, as the basis for your activism?
Well, again, that was very personal. I was a clerk typist at Harvard University, and I had a college degree, but I couldn't imagine myself getting a job other than these entry-level jobs like waitressing and typing. And a bunch of us at Harvard, a group of 10, started sitting around talking about our jobs. And we talked about low pay, unequal pay, training men to be our own supervisors, and having to do favors, all kinds of favors for our bosses. And from there, it wasn't long before we started putting out a newsletter, passing it out all over town at the tea stops in Boston, and trying to reach as many women as we could. And then we started holding meetings. Soon enough, we were taking on the biggest corporate titans in town and winning millions of dollars in back pay and raises from banks, insurance companies, publishing houses, universities. We got government agencies working on our behalf. We ended up inspiring the Hollywood movie 9 to 5 and Dolly Parton's song, and we made countless bosses get their own coffee.
I love that. There are people, certainly women of a certain age, my age group, that will relate to everything in this book. For those, after being involved so deeply with this founding of this movement, such as the 9 to 5 movement, what sort of process did you use in writing of this book to step back and see this sort of in the overall historical context?
Well, let me say that right from the start, we saw ourselves as heirs to earlier labor conflicts and working women's uprisings. So at the turn of the 20th century, the garment women of New York and New England got together, and they went out on these massive strikes of 20,000 women at a time. They made big changes, not only in their own working conditions, but in the labor movement as a whole. So we always had kind of a historical long view and felt ourselves to be the next wave of working women who were going to rise up and be heard. So when I started the book, it wasn't a big leap to think, oh, how did I fit into history? I thought of myself that way. And I started reading other accounts, but, to bring it to life as a book, I read a lot of other accounts of people in movements and how they put together that story and how they blended the personal and the larger picture. And then, of course, I had boxes and boxes of my old diaries and my old notes and notebooks that when we were 9 to 5 organizers, we would go out for lunch with women and listen very, very carefully to how people talked about their jobs. And then we would come back to the office and write it all down in these notebooks and what women were saying and what we thought might be able to happen. So I had a lot of that. I went to archives. I went to the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, that is a library and archive for the women's movement. That was fantastic. I went to Chicago, where I had trained as an organizer at the Midwest Academy, and looked at their holdings at the historical museum there. I looked at Wayne State University Library had done a whole raft of interviews of women who had been involved in the 9 to 5 movement. I read those over very carefully. So I had to blend and weave and make a quilt of all this material.
Well, that's really fascinating. I mean, it's certainly, with all these diaries and things that you kept from the time, that you certainly had a historical perspective in mind, just as the way that you worked. What I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the other organizers, especially working with people like Karen Nussbaum and Janet Seltzer.
Yeah, when the 9 to 5 movement began, we were just, as I said, sitting around in a circle. But then we got an office at the YWCA, a tiny, tiny office. It was so small, but we had to get co-tenants because we didn't have the money to pay for the whole thing itself. So we were crammed in there. And it was so exciting to work with Karen Nussbaum, who was who I knew from college, and we started the organization together. And one day someone showed up at the door, knocked on this glass door that we had at the Y, and said she wanted to join our staff. And that was Janet Seltzer. And in time, we recruited other people right out of the clerical workforce. We were all clerical workers too. And we had, found ways to quit our jobs and raise money to be full-time organizers. So it was an electric atmosphere. We couldn't get enough of each other. And when the workday was over, we'd often repair to some nearby restaurant and talk and talk and talk. We got together for breakfast meetings, and we were constantly challenging our own assumptions and trying to figure out, how to do this. And we were full of beans, and we thought we could do anything, but we had to really step back. And for example, we thought women were going to be willing to form little posses and go striding into their bosses' offices and ask and demand and so on. That wasn't true. We had to listen to what people really were ready to do, which was, meant going through some steps. People were afraid to speak in public. They were afraid to take on their bosses. And we had to dream up some ways for voices to be heard safely. So for example, when we took on the biggest bank in town, First National Bank of Boston, we started a hotline, an anonymous hotline for women to call us and say what it was like to work at the bank. And then we wrote down what they said and fed it back to people in a newsletter right outside the bank. So we stood out there handing out these leaflets saying, here's what people are telling us about what it's like to work here. And the bosses took notice.
Well, it's really fascinating. I'm sure it was really scary for a lot of these women, afraid to lose their jobs when you're, a worker at, will, and they can just do whatever they want if they hear you're making trouble for them. One of the curiosities I had when reading this history was the distinctions between 9 to 5, the organization, and 925, the labor union, the numbers 925, the labor unions. Could you explain to our listeners a little bit about those differences and how they came about? Because that might confuse people.
Well, 9 to 5 was not a union. It was an association and you could join as an individual. But a union requires you to get a majority of workers at that workplace to vote, yes, we want a union and we want to negotiate, collectively bargain with our employer. So right from the start, we didn't start out as a union. We went around and talked to union officials about how we would do that, how we would get women, make a union option available to women. But pretty soon we started something called Local 925, the numerals, in Boston, and we started organizing and publishing houses and other places. And then in 1981, we had expanded nationwide, and we made an affiliation with the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, to have a nationwide organizing effort called District 925. And you say it was a little confusing, 9 to 5, 925. Well, that was completely deliberate. We wanted people to confuse the two. And we wanted there to be a really close connection between 9 to 5, the organization that was busy raising hell and making a big hullabaloo in cities across the country, and the union, where it was the formal National Labor Relations Board authorized workplace by workplace bargaining efforts. And the two are very different, but they worked in tandem.
Well, thank you very much explaining that. And I'm sure our viewers actually have a question that is sitting in their heads right now, and that is how they're interested in the origin story of the movie and the song Working 9 to 5 and the song by Dolly Parton. Can you give us a quick overview how that was? Yeah. And how was your organization, if they maintained a relationship about the filming and so on? How did that come about?
That was such a thrill. Jane Fonda, the actor, knew Karen Nussbaum, one of our founding members, from the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. And Karen had been keeping Jane Fonda informed of all our doings. The boss who required his secretary to sew up a hole in his pants while he was wearing them, for example, and what we did to that boss, and the concerns and the complaints of office workers. And one day in late 1970s, Jane came to us and said she wanted to make a movie about the concerns of office workers. We were so excited. And she brought her team to meet with a group of our members. And it was a little awkward, a little stiff. But then one of her team posed this question: have you ever fantasized about doing in your boss? And there was a moment of stunned silence. And then the room just
Can't imagine.
exploded because it turned out everybody had. There was one woman who had fantasized about grinding her boss up in the coffee grinder, and another one who fantasized about swiveling her boss in his swivel chair and swiveling him right out the window. All those fantasies went right into the film. And the film was a huge Hollywood hit. It just amazed the studio owners. And the atmosphere in the theaters was just electric because women office workers had never seen ourselves on the big screen before like that as the main characters. So when Jane Fonda is in the movie, is introduced to this giant copying machine, and she's trying to figure out how it works, and papers start flying out of different orifices and her lip is starting to tremble, women would stand up in the theater and yell, "Push the stop button." And so people took it very personally. And the
That's
thing
so
is,
funny.
our movement had inspired the movie and the song, but the movie and the song gave our movement a huge boost. And after that movie came out, things were really different. We had won the debate. During the 70s, we had to argue with people about whether there was discrimination or whether women minded being at the very bottom of the office hierarchy. And did bosses have the right to ask a secretary to do absolutely anything or not? So after that movie came out, that was over. It was a comedy, but it proved that women could run the office better than their bosses, and that boss behavior was just ridiculous. And so then it was time to consolidate our power, and that's when we started our union.
Yeah, there's, so much hilarity in the movie, and it's great that to take these really serious issues and with humor to make them and open up the discussion, to a population and let them be able to see what's really going on. And that was great. I was wondering one thing also is, this is started off as in Boston, in a Boston-based school, and can you talk about how the city of Boston was chosen? I mean, there are office workers everywhere in every city. So how was Boston chosen as the test market for your efforts? And, I was thinking about Chicago or Cincinnati or whatever it was, other places. How did you decide to stick it into Boston and do this city versus others?
Well, it was just because this is where we were. So we started where we lived. But there were efforts like that bubbling up in Chicago and New York and San Francisco, all over the country. We heard from people all over. And then we started targeting cities for expansion. And we decided to really make the most of this uprising of a part of the workforce. We needed to be everywhere. And one of the things about Boston was that the workforce in the offices downtown was almost entirely white. And it was like 95% plus white. And only at 5 o'clock did women of color show up downtown and go into those office buildings to clean them. But as far as office work itself, it was white. And we wanted to build a multiracial, multicultural, multi-class movement. And so we targeted cities for expansion that had a diverse workforce, like Baltimore and Cleveland and Milwaukee and Atlanta. And we succeeded in building a multiracial organization, which didn't just happen. It took conscious effort, and it's an achievement that I feel really proud of.
That's really great. Another thing that I was interested in the book really was, I thought, a really important point in the book was that you're organizing. You're out of college, you have college, and you have some experience working as an office worker, but you're organizing. You received training on how to be an organizer in this Midwest Academy. can you address today young people who are, and there's so many who are very anxious to be activists and to get out there and do something, the importance, or how you feel you've got the importance of being trained in methods to organize, and how you might feel that might be important today?
It was great. When we were handing out our newsletter, we realized we didn't really know what to do after we handed out the newsletter. How are we going to get an organization off the ground? And right around then, we received a flyer about a new organizing school that was starting called the Midwest Academy. And there was this flyer and said, apply here. And it was a summer session. And our group scraped together our pennies and sent me to Chicago for a month to learn the tools of organizing. The Midwest Academy still exists today, and it still trains people. It has so far has trained tens of thousands of people in the nuts and bolts of organizing, the skills of community organizing, women's organizing, labor organizing. And I really was turned around by that experience, and I brought back the lore from the Midwest Academy to my friends back in Boston, and it really turned us around. For example, one of the things they taught me was how the so-called, what they called the rock pile theory of organizing was really not the way to go. This one instructor sat me down and he said, you know what you're doing? You're trying to recruit people one at a time and put them in a room together and wait until you've got this pile, like a rock pile, and then you're going to decide what to do. Well, that's backwards. What you need to do is figure out some things to do and some things you can win, and then people will come flocking to you. And that was really a new concept for us. Another thing that we were urged to do was get out there and really listen to how people talked about their jobs. And for example, I would use the word wages. Well, nobody used that word. That was some kind of old-fashioned union talk. What people said was pay or paycheck or salary. And these words are really important. People didn't, you know, I would go to lunch with somebody, and before she even sat down, she would say, just want to let you know, I am not a feminist. Oh, but I'm for equal pay for equal work, and I think women are getting a raw deal, and I want to do something about it with other women. Okay, well, good enough. You know, we don't have to let the word feminism.
Yeah,
be
people didn't
enough.
want to be labeled, I guess. And yeah, I
Yeah.
was fascinated by your lunch methods.
Yes, and how I learned never bring an artichoke to a recruitment lunch. That's one of the main principles I learned the hard way.
Yeah. Obviously, things have changed dramatically, and not in small part to all the kinds of work that you and others did for women in the workplace. And it's been a half century since you got started on this project, and the conditions have improved. I think, you know, I mean, presumably for the better, although there are certainly long ways to go for lots and lots of workers. What areas specifically do you feel we need to still focus on and improve in for women in the workplace?
Yeah, so things really have changed in 50 years. Issues that used to be considered individual issues are now matters of policy, union policy, corporate policy, government policy. So pregnancy discrimination is illegal today. Sexual harassment is illegal. You don't see help wanted male and help wanted female ads in the newspapers anymore. And managerial jobs have opened up to college-educated women. But in some ways, it's harder to be a worker in today's economy than it was 50 years ago. In the gig economy, people are working 2 and 3 jobs just to put food on the table. And people lack, you know, more people lack paid vacation and regular schedules and pensions and benefits. There's computerized monitoring that makes people's work days miserable, relentless schedules. But the great thing is the surge of workplace activism that we're seeing today, where restaurant workers, retail workers, warehouse workers, grad students are organizing today using the tactics that make sense for people today, not just what we did back then, but things they're dreaming up on their own. And more people support unions today than have in 2 generations. So I have hope.
Well, thank you. What would be a main takeaway of your own that you'd like a reader to have when finishing this book that you can talk to our audience about?
Well, I'm hoping that people will learn from the 9 to 5 story, but not, and you know, my book includes a lot of very specific lore about like how to hold a meeting and what we did to make sure people felt comfortable coming into the organization, how to develop leadership and so on, all that sort of woven into the story. But there's an old labor song that I think sums up my message, which is, it says, freedom is a hard-won thing. You've got to work for it, fight for it, day and night for it, and every generation's got to win it again. So expect to find your own path while learning from people, from your elders, and go for it.
Thank you. Well, this has been wonderful talking with you today. Ellen, thank you for coming to Books at Berklee and sharing your insights, and your book with us is wonderful. And I'm sure a lot of women will want to read it.
Great.
And others.
Good talking with you, Judy.
Thank you.